Picture a hangar in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. The roof collapses with a roar, a cloud of dust rises, and beneath the rubble of concrete and steel dies the only spacecraft in Soviet history that actually flew into space and returned. This didn't happen during a launch or during some accident in orbit. It happened in 2002, 13 years after the spacecraft had come back from space intact and undamaged, and simply stood there, forgotten, in a decaying building, until that building fell on top of it. We're talking, of course, about Buran, the Soviet answer to the American space shuttle. Dozens of videos already cover the project itself, why it was created, how it differed from the shuttle, why the program was shut down. Today we're not going to talk about that. Today we're talking about the fate of specific physical objects. The ships, the mock-ups, the engines, the hangars. Where they are now, who last saw them, and why one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century turned into a collection of rusting ghosts scattered across the globe, from the Kazakh steppe to a beach in Bahrain. Let's start from the beginning. Before we talk about the fate of the Burans, it's worth sorting out how many were actually built, because this question confuses even a good number of spaceflight enthusiasts. The Buran program wasn't a single spacecraft. It was an entire series of articles, each with its own purpose. First, there were test mock-ups for atmospheric trials, the so-called BTS units, standing for Bolshoi Transportny Samolет, or Large Transport Aircraft, under their product index. The most famous of these, BTS 002, was fitted with 4 jet engines that let it take off on its own, like an ordinary airplane, to practice landing approaches. This wasn't a spacecraft in the full sense. It had no heat shielding and no complete set of onboard systems. But it was on this very vehicle that test pilots trained to land the future orbital vehicle. Second, there were full orbital spacecraft capable of actual spaceflight. The first of these, Product 1K, received its own name, Buran, and it was this vehicle that carried out that famous uncrewed flight on November 15, 1988. The second flight-ready vehicle, Product 1K2, carried the unofficial name Beria, later Ptichka, Little Bird. Its construction reached roughly 95 to 97% completion, but it never flew into space. There was also a third hull, 2K, whose assembly had only just begun when work stopped. It never came close to completion. On top of all this, there were separate full-scale mock-ups for ground testing, for structural strength trials, for electrical systems testing, for cosmonaut training in the hydro laboratory. One of these, known as OKMT or Buran-T, was used to test how the spacecraft handled weight and mechanical loads. The very one that later went on a rather unexpected journey, which we'll get to. So when someone says the fate of Buran, it's always worth clarifying which Buran they mean. Because each one's fate is its own story. Let's start with the main character. Orbital Vehicle 1K, the one that actually made that historic uncrewed flight. On November 15, 1988, this spacecraft launched aboard the Energia rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, made 2 orbits of the Earth, and landed in fully automatic mode, with no one aboard, on a specially built runway. It was a technological triumph. At that moment, no other country could land a vehicle of this size completely automatically, let alone in crosswinds that forced the onboard computer to independently correct its approach trajectory, a maneuver that initially alarmed ground observers, who assumed something had gone wrong. But the triumph was short-lived. The Soviet Union was collapsing, funding for the space sector was falling apart, and the very concept of a heavy, reusable spacecraft without a clear practical application became increasingly hard to justify economically. A second flight never happened. The program was formally frozen in 1990 and shut down for good in 1993. Meanwhile, the spacecraft itself sat at Baikonur, inside the assembly and test building at Site 112, a massive hangar originally built for assembling the N-1 rockets back in the days of the Soviet lunar program. It stood next to the Energia rocket that had once carried it into orbit. On May 12, 2002, the roof of that hangar collapsed. The official cause: roof failure due to accumulated moisture, structural aging, and a lack of proper maintenance throughout the 1990s, when there simply wasn't money to maintain the Cosmodrome's facilities. 8 Cosmodrome workers who were carrying out repairs died under the rubble. And under that same rubble, the Buran spacecraft, the only one that had ever actually flown into space, was completely destroyed. This is one of the most painful symbols of the decline of Soviet spaceflight. A vehicle that survived weightlessness, atmospheric re-entry at several times the speed of sound, and an automatic landing in gusting wind, but couldn't survive a leaking roof. Today, the site of that hangar is a ruin. Some of the spacecraft's wreckage has been cleared away. Some of it still lies under the collapsed concrete slabs. The place has become one of the best-known sites for so-called industrial tourism. For years, photographers and abandoned place explorers illegally entered this section of Baikonur to capture haunting images of the remnants of the Soviet space dream. These very photographs, which spread across the internet in the 2010s, were for many people in the West their first introduction to the existence of Buran at all, the second flight-ready vehicle, the one unofficially called Beria, later Ptichka, deserves its own story, because for a long time its fate remained the most uncertain of all. At the time the program was shut down in 1993, this spacecraft was roughly 95 to 97% complete. That meant, in theory, that with relatively minor additional work, it could actually have flown. There were even plans for its use, including proposals for international cooperation, discussed at the highest levels in the early post-Soviet years, when Russia was trying to find some application for its accumulated space technology. But there was no money. Ptichka was mothballed in a different assembly and test building at Baikonur, one that wasn't affected by the 2002 collapse. For years it stood there, gathering dust, partially stripped by scavengers who cut out its non-ferrous metals and electronic equipment to sell as scrap. A separate, sad chapter in Baikonur's history through the 1990s and 2000s. Facilities that had once cost billions of Soviet rubles were looted for the price of scrap metal. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, there were periodic reports of plans to turn Ptichka into a museum exhibit right at Baikonur, inside the very hangar where it stood. There was even talk of building a museum complex around it. But putting these plans into practice kept stalling for years over jurisdictional complications. Baikonur is leased by Russia from Kazakhstan, and the question of who actually owns the spacecraft and who should fund its preservation remained unresolved. In the 2010s, Kazakh authorities began to insist that objects that physically remained on Baikonur territory and were never removed should, legally speaking, become Kazakh property. This added a political dimension to what had seemed like a purely museum-related question. As of the mid-2020s, Ptichka still sits at Baikonur, in a state of preservation that keeps gradually deteriorating. Reports have surfaced of Roscosmos's intent to move the spacecraft to Russia for restoration and eventual museum display, with its possible placement discussed at the Patriot Park Military History Complex near Moscow, or at one of Russia's aerospace museums. Yet these plans have been postponed repeatedly, and no final decision on the fate of the second Buran has been made to this day. This is, perhaps, the biggest ongoing mystery in this whole story. A spacecraft that came within a step of flying continues to wait for its fate in a half-ruined hangar more than 30 years later. Now for the most visually striking part of this story. What happened to the numerous mock-ups built for testing, training, and exhibitions? Unlike the flight-ready ships, these objects didn't stay put. They scattered across the planet, and some of their routes look almost absurd. The Sydney mock-up. One full-scale Buran mock-up went on a tour of demonstrations in the mid-1990s, meant to earn badly needed hard currency for the Russian space industry. It appeared at a world exhibition in Sydney, then in Bahrain, and eventually got stuck in Europe over unpaid transport and storage debts. This story is a saga of its own. Lawsuits, seizures, and changes of ownership. Typical of the 1990s, when the Soviet space legacy was quite literally sold off piece by piece just to survive. The mock-up in Gorky Park, Moscow. One of the most famous mock-ups, the one that had been shown at exhibitions, including the Paris Air Show at Le Bourget in 1989, eventually ended up in Moscow's Gorky Park, where, into the early 2010s, it operated as an attraction. A 4D cinema simulating a space flight was built inside it. In 2015, this mock-up was damaged by a fire, officially caused by a short circuit in the cinema's equipment. It was later restored and is now on display at Moscow's VDNKH exhibition grounds, as part of a wider space history exhibit alongside other artifacts of Soviet cosmonautics. The Technik Museum in Speyer, Germany. This is, perhaps, the most remarkable story of them all. The very OKMT mock-up used for ground structural strength testing at Baikonur was purchased in the 1990s by the German Technik Museum in the city of Speyer. It had to be transported by water, first by barge down the Danube and across the Black Sea, then through several European ports, before finally reaching Germany. Today, this Buran is one of the museum's centerpiece exhibits, mounted several meters up on a special support structure next to a real Antonov and 22 aircraft, and visitors can walk inside it to see the cockpit and cargo bay. This is likely the best preserved and most publicly accessible Buran in the world today. BTS 002 and Bahrain. The atmospheric test vehicle BTS 002, the one that could take off under its own jet power to practice landings, after a long series of wanderings and several exhibitions, ended up in Bahrain, where for years it sat out in the open under the scorching Gulf sun, gradually deteriorating from corrosion and heat. Only in the 2010s was it bought back and returned to Russia, where it underwent restoration. Today, this vehicle can be seen at Patriot Park near Moscow, one of the few mock-ups whose fate ended relatively well, with a return home and a decent state of preservation. Altogether, to sum it up, of the nearly 20 different full-scale mock-ups and test articles built under the program, only a handful ended up in well-maintained museum conditions. Most either rotted outdoors, were stripped for scrap, or are still awaiting their fate in abandoned hangars. And by now, not just at Baikonur, but at the manufacturing plants in Russia as well. Talk of Buran often overshadows the fate of an equally impressive object, the Energia Super Heavy launch vehicle, which was, after all, what actually carried the spacecraft into orbit. This was one of the most powerful rockets in human history, capable of delivering payloads to orbit comparable to the lift capacity of America's Saturn V. Only 2 Energia launches ever took place, the first in 1987, carrying the test payload Polyus, which, due to an orientation failure, never reached orbit and fell into the Pacific Ocean, and the second, the famous one, in November 1988, carrying Buran. After the program shut down, the remaining pieces of Energia's production line, individual stages, engines, ground support equipment, were simply mothballed at factories in Russia and at Baikonur. Some of the RD-170 engines developed for Energia's first stage got a second life. Their modified versions are still used today on the Ukrainian Zenit rocket and, in the form of the RD-180 engine, on the American Atlas V rocket. A rather ironic fact, given the geopolitical history that followed. A full-scale mock-up of the Energia rocket can also be seen at VDNKH in Moscow, installed next to the Cosmos pavilion as part of the same exhibit that displays the restored Buran mock-up. Let's return to Baikonur and look at what's happening there now, in the mid-2020s. The assembly and test building where the first Buran was destroyed still stands in a half-ruined state. A massive steel structure with a hole in the roof through which you can see the sky and piles of concrete debris inside. This location regularly appears in videos made by so-called stalkers, people who illegally explore abandoned post-Soviet industrial sites. Despite official bans and health risks, from unstable structures to possible contamination by Heptil, a toxic rocket propellant, the stream of visitors hasn't stopped for years, and drone footage shot over the ruins has racked up millions of views on YouTube. The hangar housing Ptichka is in relatively better shape, though still far from museum conditions. There's no proper heating, ventilation, or protection from dust and moisture. Photo and video reports occasionally surface from the small number of official visitors, Roscosmos representatives, or journalists granted access, and these show the spacecraft gradually accumulating a layer of dust over the years, with individual panels of its hull showing signs of corrosion. In the 2010s and 2020s, Kazakhstan repeatedly announced intentions to turn part of Baikonur's infrastructure, including the Buran program's hangars, into an official tourist and museum site, as part of a broader push to diversify the cosmodrome's use beyond purely Russian military space launches. But funding for such initiatives remains limited, and the jurisdictional situation surrounding Russia's lease of Baikonur complicates long-term planning. There's one more layer to this story that rarely makes it into the highlight reels of rusting hulls. The people who were trained to fly Buran and the specialized equipment built just for them, which met its own strange afterlife. Unlike the American shuttle program, Buran was designed from the outset to fly without a crew at all. That historic 1988 flight proved the whole point of the automated system. But a cosmonaut group was still formed and trained for years in anticipation of eventual crewed missions. Pilots like Igor Vok, Anatoly Levchenko, Romantis Stankovicius, and several others logged enormous amounts of time in specialized aircraft and simulators, preparing for a flight that, for most of them, never came. Vok himself never got to fly Buran into space. He did, however, fly the Tu-154LL and MiG-25 aircraft that were modified to simulate Buran's unusual, brick-like handling characteristics during descent, vehicles that themselves became historical curiosities once the program ended, quietly retired to aviation museums, or simply scrapped along with everything else. The specialized flight simulators built for cosmonaut training suffered a fate similar to the spacecraft mock-ups. Some were transferred to the Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City near Moscow, where fragments of them can still occasionally be seen by visitors on official tours, repurposed, or displayed as static exhibits. Others were simply decommissioned and left to gather dust in storage buildings, their sophisticated 1980s-era computer systems long since obsolete and impossible to maintain. There's also the runway itself to consider. The massive landing strip at Yubileyny Airfield near Baikonur, built specifically for Buran's return from orbit, engineered to be one of the longest and most precisely leveled runways in the world. After the program ended, the strip found unexpected new purpose. For years it served as an emergency landing site consideration for the space shuttle in the event of certain abort scenarios during joint U.S.-Russian missions to the Mir station and later the International Space Station under agreements signed in the 1990s. Today it still exists, still technically operational, occasionally used for cargo flights and general aviation. An enormous, almost absurdly over-engineered strip of concrete in the middle of the steppe, built for a spacecraft that will never use it again. And then there's the question that inevitably comes up in the comments section of every Buran video. Could it fly again? Could Russia, or anyone else, revive the program? Periodically, Russian officials and aerospace commentators have floated the idea of a new Buran, a modernized reusable spacecraft drawing on the old program's engineering heritage. These proposals have surfaced roughly once a decade since the 2000s, usually timed to coincide with anniversaries of the original 1988 flight. And just as regularly, they've failed to progress beyond preliminary concept studies and press statements. The core problem that killed the original program, the enormous cost of a heavy-lift reusable system without a clear, sustained mission to justify it, has never really gone away. If anything, in the era of SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Starship, demonstrating that reusability could be achieved far more cheaply through vertical landing rather than a runway landing spaceplane. The original Energia architecture looks even harder to justify economically than it did in 1988. So for now, the objects remain where they are. One destroyed, one waiting, a handful preserved in museums, the rest scattered, scrapped, or slowly dissolving into the steppe. It's less a single dramatic ending than a slow scattering. Pieces of a vanished superpower's space ambitions, drifting further apart with every passing year. Why is the story of Buran's objects so popular on YouTube and social media, despite the fact that the program itself shut down more than 30 years ago? Partly, it's the aesthetics of decay. The contrast between the grandeur of the original concept, a spacecraft capable of flying to space and landing automatically, without a pilot, a technology the United States never dared attempt even with the shuttle, and the shabbiness of its final fate, rust, looting, a collapsed roof. Partly, its accessibility. Thanks to videos made by explorers and photographers, millions of people who would never be able to visit a closed military cosmodrome have been able to visually visit these places from their couch. And partly, it's because this story still isn't over. Ptichka is still standing at Baikonur. Its fate still hasn't been finally decided. In a sense, watching these photos and videos, the viewer becomes a witness to a story that is still unfolding right now. Not an archival observer of something long since finished. So, let's sum it up. Of all the objects from the Soviet Buran program, one spacecraft, the one that actually flew into space, was destroyed when its hangar roof collapsed in 2002. A second, nearly ready for flight, still sits mothballed at Baikonur, awaiting a decision on its fate. Numerous mock-ups are scattered across the world, from a museum in Speyer, Germany, to an amusement park in Moscow, from the beaches of Bahrain to exhibition halls at Vdiankaich. and the hangars where it all began are gradually turning into ruins, appealing mostly to explorers of abandoned places. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fate of Buran's objects, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which other abandoned space program or object you'd like covered next. See you next time.